Welcome to the Money and Mortgages podcast. I'm your host, Adam Coleman, accredited financial counselor and mortgage planner. Join me as I speak with fellow industry experts on all things personal finance. Welcome, everyone. This is your host, Adam Coleman, and returning to the show, I've got Brandon Cabaniss. She is a certified financial planner with Williams Wealth Management, and today we're going to be talking really more about financial planning considerations around major life transitions, more specific to divorce and caregiving, and we're going to get more into details on that. But Brandon, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me, Adam.
Of course. Well, I guess jumping into this kind of briefly, walk us through maybe some of the different life transitions and maybe why do you gravitate towards working with people that are going through major life transitions, including divorce and caregiving?
Well, it's my story personally. So I grew up with a single mom, and there were always money questions and concerns for her in her lifetime. My grandmother was a big part of my upbringing, and she was also a single woman, and my grandfather had passed at a younger age, and so she brought me into the conversation. And so I was very aware, I think, at different life stages and what's important to know and to discuss as a family. And so it's kind of my story. And then I also took care of my mother when she was ill, had to step away from my career, had young children. So I'm also aware of kind of that role and the financial toll or financial issues that can come up when you're taking on a role as a caregiver. So it's close to home.
Well, I guess those are two big ones, obviously, and everything revolves around your life changing pretty dramatically in both of those scenarios. But I guess maybe walk me through some of the biggest considerations that people have as they're going through, first divorce and then maybe more of a caregiving situation, because I know they're both very different.
Right. So as you know, different states have different laws. The length of the divorce process can vary. In South Carolina, it's typically a year, but it can be shorter. And so there's a lot that changes between the time, you decide to proceed with the divorce and the time it settles. And so depending on what stage of the game you engage a financial planner, it can make a huge difference in, I believe, the outcome financially. So I would say that based on those stages, you can have different concerns. But I think number one, that is the theme that I've seen common with someone going through divorce, is that their cash flow needs change. The cost of living may change if they're moving. Their spending plan will have to adjust. There's a lot of education around financial matters when you're going through divorce. If you've always relied on your spouse to make financial decisions, or if you've done it jointly and you're all of a sudden making these decisions on your own. So I think the cash flow is really important. I've seen typically you think you need one thing, oftentimes you need a lot more than you think as far as cash on hand and liquidity. So I think that's one of the biggest things to highlight when you're going through divorce. It's hard to see the forest through the trees. It's hard to know what you need on the other side, but sitting down with a planner and knowing kind of okay, this is what I want right now, knowing it could change in the process, or it very much likely will. And then just what are those kind of shorter term goals? Where do you want to live? How do you see your life post divorce? And then longer term goals, retirement, if you have children, what their needs for college planning and that kind of thing. So different goals you may have, short term and then long term. But again, I think those managing the cash and liquidity and income needs during the process and then post divorce is one of the biggest themes.
What does that look like different from maybe traditional, a non-divorce case or they're not going through a major life transition or anything like that? Does the procedure change for you in terms of what you're doing? I'm assuming you're still going through kind of a high level budget. You're still trying to figure out what they can afford, investment, long-term planning, things like that. What's the differences that you're coming across when you're dealing with people maybe going through a divorce or a transition like this?
Well, I think early on in the early stages of the process, you typically take your financial declaration to an attorney and you say, okay, this is what I spend right now. This is what we spend as a household. This is kind of what our marital assets look like and our marital financial situation looks like. And then you have to consider what it will look like for just you. And a lot of times you haven't thought about that yet. So it takes a lot of sort of some time to sit down and think through it and come back to it and adjust somewhat of a budget so that you know what you need. If there's some alimony that you need to consider requesting, child support. And then there's the taking the assets themselves and deciding how to split that equitably. But if I'm sitting on one side with one party, I'm trying, of course, to benefit them and to make sure that they come out in a secure place for their future. So, yeah, there's a lot of goal setting and discussion around that.
Do you find
Just
that, I
assessing where
guess,
you
the
are.
people are not trying to get as much cash on hand? Like, is that a big, not
Yeah,
not
it
necessarily a
typically
concern,
is
but is
one
that
of
an
the,
issue that you see a lot?
yeah, I mean, it typically is one of the biggest question marks because everybody kind of wants what's readily available so that they have the freedom to do with it what they need to do with it. In the case of needing to separate and live in two separate places, there's a marital home, and then the other party needs to find another place to live, and so that's going to take some cash for down payment. And so, and then there's the part of sort of resourcing them to other professionals. So I think for us, it's like looking at the big picture and what they need and trying to help them navigate the asset split, but then bringing in other professionals like banking and lending, insurance, tax, and estate, all of that, it needs to be considered as well. So there's a lot of work, to do.
Yeah, I see that quite a bit, especially when they have the house. And I feel like I tend to work with a person that is wanting to keep the home. And that is one of the biggest, I guess, missteps that people see is they're so focused on that piece of it. And then maybe they're getting some retirement accounts, but there's like nothing in terms of cash on hand. To your point, that's a major problem from a financial planning standpoint is you just don't have any liquidity. You have no emergency funds. And then if anything, you're actually having to pay out some of that because you're trying to keep the house and share some of the equity. So it's
Yeah.
interesting to hear that you're kind of running across it outside of those situations as well, because obviously I see that pretty frequently when they're trying to keep the home. Do you tend to work with the person that is more involved financially, or do you typically work with a person that maybe not as involved financially throughout
I've,
the
ha-
marriage?
I've had a little bit of everything, but typically it's been females, and let's just face the facts. And typically it's been females that have not necessarily been involved in the finances because they've taken on different roles. And I try to tell them all the time, it's okay to come in and not know things.
Right.
This is you got to start somewhere, and this is the point where you sort of take up the reins and create some financial independence and knowledge for yourself. And so it's a very empowering process, but it doesn't always start out easy, so there's a lot of kind of hand holding through the process in the initial phase with the ones that haven't been on the forefront of the decision making. They really trust me to help them make decisions. So, but I always say, look, in a marriage it's a partnership and you contribute in different ways. And I always tell the story that if something happened to my sweet husband, I wouldn't be able to change the filters in the house. So there are jobs that I give him and there are jobs that he gives me, and I think that's nothing to be ashamed of. So yeah, we start where you are. And I can say, just to what we were talking about with the liquidity piece, one of the first divorce clients I gained that came to me, she received the house and she received some retirement assets. And like you said, is a nice net worth amount and on paper, but there was no liquidity. And she's a real estate agent, or became one, got licensed, and there's a lot of opportunity to build and grow wealth there, but money comes in chunks and it's not very consistent month to month. So we found that she was really she was going to dip into her retirement savings, and there's penalties for that and there's taxes on that. And so, yeah, I think that I prefer to start speaking with the divorced client or the one that's in the process in the early goings, because then we can really determine what's best for them along the way so they don't get in that situation, and they have more cash. I mean, it might mean that you have to, nudge the attorney to start working on, getting appraisals on properties and get some things sold so that we can create more liquidity.
Right. Yeah, and I guess, do you have any suggestions on, like you said, South Carolina, the process does take a while. Are there any financial planning tips or considerations as they're going through that process just to protect themselves and then also just to maintain that emergency fund or liquidity? Because I do see that quite a bit where people are just pulling from all sorts of random accounts just to cover attorney's bills, because obviously it's very expensive. Do you have any suggestions for people going through that process to try to protect themselves?
Well, I mean, not to toot my horn, but I really do think that like engaging a planner on the early goings is important because unbeknownst to me, I've found myself being called an advocate. Someone that's a third party that's not part of the divorce party that is nudging the attorney to like get some things done and to have some meetings early and make some decisions early to go ahead and start dividing assets, because you can divide assets early in the process. You don't have to wait till everything's settled.
Right.
So it has to finalize at some point, but you can start setting up a new life for yourself and creating, income streams and having some cash, to do what you need to do. But having that advocate to kind of nudge your attorney, another professional, it definitely helps.
What does that look like, I guess, from a documentation standpoint? If you do start separating assets before everything is finalized, are you getting something in agreement and signed by both
Yes,
parties that are showing, or we're already
yes,
splitting this asset account up, and then you just open up individual accounts in their own individual names?
that's right. Yep. So you go ahead and split. You can go ahead and split. IRA accounts can be split pretty easily. Taxable, like joint accounts, can obviously be split pretty easily, or an account in one party's name you can go ahead and split that. So it takes a while to finalize agreements, but there are certain asset types that are easier to go ahead and split. And it's the attorney's job to kind of keep track of that and make sure at the very end that everything's equitable. But yeah, you can go ahead and start the process for sure. We usually recommend getting a separate email address for the communication between the attorney and the financial planner and everything, and the other professionals during that time is helpful. And then just setting up a separate bank account in your name is important.
Why don't some people do that? Because I see that all the time where people wait way too late to actually set up separate accounts, or they think that they're not allowed to. Like, do you
I
understand
just
why that
think
would
you
be the case?
don't, yeah, I just think you don't know what you don't know. And
Right.
I think I'm learning too along this process. This wasn't always my focus in my work, but I'm learning along the way, and I'm trying to keep some tips and notes for clients. But I think part of it is just the emotional toll that is happening when you're going through something like that. And it's just so much to keep up with and so much back and forth, and you just don't know what you can do until someone
Right.
tells you.
Well, and in fairness, the attorneys are not always going to be experts in the financial matter as
That's
well.
right.
So not having somebody involved in the financial side certainly would help and kind of keep that process going. If somebody like you or like similar like CDFA or some kind of financial advisor would definitely be advantageous along the way for sure. So how does that differ, I guess, for a caregiving situation? Because night and day different, but still kind of the same type of emotional issues to deal with, and then also financial planning considerations to think about as well. So what are the main differences that you run across with a caregiving situation?
Yeah, I think with caregiving, it either comes on slowly or it comes on suddenly, and
Mm,
divorce is kind of the same way. But I think that you either know, like, you are the spouse, so that you're going to you're going to take on that role. Maybe you see a disease progressing or something like that. But a lot of times it just it just hits you out of nowhere. I mean, with my mother, for instance, I was going from being a part-time, working part-time and keeping my kids at home, and I was about to enter back into the workforce full time, and I got the call she had breast cancer, and she's a
mm,
single woman. And I said, well, you need to move to Greenville and I'm going to take care of you. And I called my office and I said, sorry, I'm not coming back full time yet. And so,
right.
if you think about what that does for somebody, emotionally, number one, I mean, it was a no-brainer what I was going to do. But from the financial perspective, like, you have a plan. Like, my husband and I had a plan, and maybe it meant that he could retire earlier if I went back to work earlier. I mean, there's some disruptions to the caregiving role sometimes, and so to your own financial plan. So I think that's one of the things that knowing, I think, when you're in your mid, I'd say mid 30s, to be thinking about your parents and what their care will look like in the future, having the conversations early, all of that's really important, so that you're not sort of blindsided by that. Because when you're in that role and they can't care for themselves, they can't pay their own bills. In this case, my mom was in two different, she had two different locations. I had moved her to Greenville. She still had a house in Georgia. We had to pay the bills there and all of that. So I had to get everything changed over to my name and help her with that whole process. And then we just kind of, from that point on, that I just took on that role. So there's so many different pieces to the caregiving role that I don't think people realize. If they move their parents closer, they're going to start going to doctor's appointments. They're going to start paying attention to the finances, perhaps. So it's a big piece of the financial planning. And especially in this time we're in where people are living longer, our parents are living longer, it's an important piece to the financial planning.
You dealt with it obviously personally. So, and you kind of have a unique perspective since you are a financial planner and you dealt with it personally. Like, what did that look like, if you don't mind getting into some of that? But is it still kind of the same process that you went through? Like, obviously, you and your husband had to decide, all right, budgeting wise, what does this look like long-term planning? Did it differ too much from what you would normally see with somebody going through any other transition by going through this? Like, any other considerations that you had to keep in mind?
Yeah, I think it's just you're taking on so much more. So when you
Yeah.
take on something new, you kind of have to put something else down. And I think that's one of the things I wasn't prepared for that I want to help other people prepare for is that, you may get the kids out of the house and think you and your husband are going to go travel and either he gets ill or, his parents get ill or your parents get ill and then
Right.
you're taking on. And so it's kind of those foreseen circumstances that, and hard conversations and just abrupt changes in life, that you have to plan for.
Do you advise other people a certain way, I guess? And more specifically, like if there's more than one child, like how do you plan accordingly to that if there's multiple siblings that are
Yeah,
potentially looking into that? Like where does that come into play for
that's a
you?
great question. Yeah, that's a great question. So not only have I experienced it personally, but I've seen a lot of it in my practice with our clientele. When I started in the industry, I was in my 20s. We had a lot of clients that were about to retire. Now those clients are aging and they're in their 80s and we're working with their kids. And so there's maybe multiple generations there. And I think typically what happens is that when one parent starts to have some health concerns, we are aware of it because we see them 4 times a year and we
Right.
know what their financial and typically their health situation is like. And so that's typically a great time when a third party is present to say, okay, why don't we, have you talked to your kids about this? Would you like to have a conversation with them, an open dialogue together? Or would you like to have that separate and then see how you want to bring them in? That's a hard decision. Sometimes the kids want to work together and sometimes, in the case of my sister, she had a young child and was living in another place and she just couldn't take that role on. But then
Right.
when it was time to sell my mom's house, I asked her, can you do that part? Like I'm doing
Okay.
this with her health. Can you help do the house? And she did. She took up that job and she did that. So I think it's a division of responsibility. It's not easy, but you figure it out. But
Right.
again, open dialogue is the way.
Do you typically find that people are bringing in at least one of their kids into these financial planning sessions to help with that, or are they not taking your advice to do that, and then it's too late in the process to really have those conversations?
I've seen both. It's sometimes too late. I'm not too late. It's never too late, but
Right.
it's late enough that it imposes a bit of stress and burden on the family. I think the earlier the better. And I've written pieces and had some webinars on this topic specifically, like how to start the conversation. And I'm happy to share that with you for your listeners. But there's, specific wording and ways you can the summer's a great time to do that. You don't want to ruin a fun hot dog dinner, around the fire or
Right.
whatever time with family and talking about hard stuff and yucky stuff. But sometimes it's the best time to talk about it. Like, look, we're aging. We don't know if we can live in this house forever. We need to talk about our next stage planning. What does that look like? I recently went to visit a client and sat with their kids and we talked about, okay, how can we modify the house? What would that cost? If we need to move out and go to facility care, what would that cost? Can we afford it? And having those conversations, I have the kids call me later and say, oh my gosh, I'm so relieved because I
Oh yeah.
couldn't have that conversation with them directly without an argument. And having you
Right.
there created a sense of safe, open dialogue and it was really important and relieved me to know that we have a plan, that it's not keeping me up at night wondering, are my parents going to try to stay in their house forever when it's 2 stories and one of them has dementia? Like, it really needs to be discussed as early as possible.
I guess, what's your take on like long-term planning, like long-term care insurance and things like that? Do you tend to find benefits there, or are there issues with it to where it almost costs more than it's worth?
Typically, if you purchased a long-term care policy a while back, you probably have great benefits. Unfortunately, with rising interest rates and the risk and the rising healthcare costs, the traditional policies are too expensive now. There are ways to strategize around life insurance where you can leverage life insurance cash value and add like long-term care to that and to a life policy for some coverage. But it's not likely that you're ever going to fully cover the cost of long-term care. But we
Right.
also know that we don't know if we're going to need it. It's like a 50-50 chance kind of that we're going to need long-term care in our lifetime. So it's better to have something that's like not a use it or lose it, like the traditional policies. And if you have something that still has a death benefit, so that if you didn't need it, there was something to go to your heirs, but if you needed it, it would kick in and cover some of the cost of care. And then that would protect your assets for your spouse or your kids.
Gotcha. I know with long-term care, like standalone long-term care, there was always kind of like that age range where you didn't want to get it too early, but you also didn't want to wait too late. Life insurance kind of has a different component to it. Is there sort of a golden rule of an age that you kind of want to focus on the cash value with a long-term care rider attached to it?
I
Or
think
is
that
there
really
not?
depends on your health.
Okay.
So if you're in, say, your 50s and you're healthy and you have cash flow, like your
Hmm.
retirement plan is such that you're like a good 5 to 10 years out from retirement, and you have the strong cash flow,
Yeah.
you can weigh the benefits of buying a long-term care, like a whole life policy with a long-term care rider versus investing that money. So with your age and your health, it's the underwriting question.
Is there sort of like a net worth rule of thumb that you tend to look at where if, all right, if they have that much money already saved in investments, is it easier just to self-fund, or does that really not come into play in your world?
It's a great question, and it's one that I often want to quantify that, but it's hard because everybody's plan is so different based on
Right.
their lifestyles and their spending, right? So if you're a modest spender and you have a nice several $1 million, you're probably going to be able to self-fund your own long-term care need at some point, but it all depends, right? So it all depends on your spending. So, but if you're a bigger spender and you have a bigger lifestyle, $3 million may not be enough. So
Right.
it's not a real clear-cut answer on that, but
I guess besides long-term care or life insurance with the rider, are there any other pre-planning methodologies or different products that could work or would help people pre-plan for the caregiving risk that comes into play?
there are some new products out there, like with annuities, where you can purchase an annuity that is going to create like a pension like income
Right.
stream in retirement. And then if it has like a chronic illness rider on it, that if you needed long-term care, it would double. There are some
Oh, okay.
products out there like that are alternatives to just traditional long-term care or life insurance. And those don't require underwriting, which is nice. So
Okay.
if you already have a preconceived health issue and you just kind of want to ease your mind that something is going to kick in and pay that extra cost, because it can be anywhere from $10,000 a month to, depending on where you go and what kind of care you need, 10 to 15,000 a month. So it can really creep up and cause havoc to a plan.
I know it's a big range, but is there a certain number of years that you sort of plan within your financial plans?
We'll create some what if scenarios and plans. So you'll have your typical, financial plan where you have cash flow through retirement and you have your different income streams. And we'll throw in like a what if scenario if the client's concerned about it. What if I needed long-term care the last 3 years of my life? Typically, a long-term care need is not longer than 3 years. That's kind of the average.
Okay.
1 to 3 really is the average. So like we can show that in the plan if they needed an additional 10,000 a month in expenses those last 3 years. What would that do to their portfolio values and their overall net worth?
I know there's legal ways to mitigate some of the risk with a divorce, but like from a financial planning standpoint, do you really ever get into sort of planning that ahead of time? Obviously, nobody wants to plan that beforehand, but are there any other products or, considerations that you're going through with a financial plan, having that in the back of your mind to think that that might be a possibility, that we want to mitigate some of the risks of a possible future divorce?
That's a great question. I mean, prenuptial agreements, I would imagine, are a way
Sure.
to go ahead and kind of plan for that what if scenario. I do think personally that the non-working spouse should have some sort of savings account for the value of, say, caring for the home and the children, if that's what they so choose to do. That's just something I've created in my own mind. But yeah, I mean, there's spousal IRAs can be a way to build value in your own name. I think, making sure assets are jointly owned so that both parties feel a sense of financial empowerment during the marriage. I think that's really important. I think that can sometimes mitigate a lot of problems and arguments in marriage over money.
Going back a little bit to having a separate account, do you find that having a standalone account for each of them and then a joint account for monthly bills, do you find that that works more effectively? Or is there some other method that you've tended to see more successful with kind of how to bridge the gap between maybe one person that makes more money versus somebody that doesn't make as much, and they're trying to figure out how to budget properly and plan accordingly for the future and kind of keep things separate to some certain degree?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that tactic of having the joint family account and then separate accounts. But again, I think that when the paycheck comes in and it's a paycheck for the family, it's for the household, that's the plan, that maybe a portion of that goes to the non-working spouse, right? And a
Right.
portion goes into the family account and a portion goes into the working spouse. I think that would be a good way to just make the non-working spouse feel empowered, that they've got a huge contribution too, because the things that they do allow the working spouse to do their job. I mean, we value that when we look at insurance, life insurance.
Right.
If
Yeah.
you go to get a life insurance policy for yourself and your spouse, you consider your earnings, right? Because it's the loss of earnings you're insuring against losing. So even a non-working spouse, if there's kids at home, you'd have to call and pay a nanny or caregiver
Right.
for
No, there's a
the
huge value to that
there's a
that
huge
doesn't get
value.
factored in for sure.
That's right.
Well, interesting. This has been super helpful. I think a lot of people don't really think through those, and they don't necessarily combine those two life transitions in mind, but they do tend to have similar features that you have to kind of keep in mind. Any other specific advice for people going through either of those, divorce or caregiving, that you could give to people thinking about that process?
I just think that you can't minimize the value in having a team of people to kind of
Yep.
help you and guide you through these times, and you can't do it all on your own, and there's a lot you don't know, and you don't know what questions to ask, and you don't want to look back and say, oh, I should have, I could have, I would have done that differently. And so having a team to kind of guide you is really important. So
Definitely. No, I think having a second set of eyes on everything is certainly a huge benefit to people, and it's just things that you're not going to think about because your brain's foggy. There's
yeah,
other stuff going on. You've got,
yeah,
way too many emotions coming into play. So having that third party, not, I wouldn't say uninterested, there's certainly an advocacy role, but having somebody that's not necessarily in it full time to be able to kind of come back and review the information and try to give you some different tips would be a hugely valuable person to have, I think. If somebody wanted to learn more about you and your group, what's the best way to find you?
yeah. So we're in Greenville, South Carolina. The website address is www.greenville.com, and we're on LinkedIn and Facebook as well. And I try to write periodically about some of these topics. So make sure to check out our resource page and articles and sites.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll include the website on the description. So definitely check it out for a lot of good free resources. I would highly advise that. Brandon, it's always a pleasure. I appreciate all the insights.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
Anytime. All right. Thanks.